Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Janna Vallabha Girivardhari Gopi Janna Vallabha Girivardhari Yashodanandana Prajajannaranjana Yashodanandana Prajajannaranjana Jamuna Tira Vanachari Jamuna Tira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Janna Vallabha Girivardhari Gopi Janna Vallabha Girivardhari Yashodanandana Prajajannaranjana Yashodanandana Prajajannaranjana Jamuna Tira Vanachari Jamuna Tira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Jayam Vishnupad Paramhansa Parabrajacharya Astutara Sata Sri Srimad, His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda ki jai. Nam Acharya Srila Haridas Thakur ki jai. Prem Shikaho Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhara Sri Vasa Adi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda ki jai. Sri Radha Krishna Gopa Gopinath Shama Kunda Radha Kunda Gira Govardhan ki jai. Sri Vrindavan Dham ki jai. Sri Mayapur Navadvip Dham ki jai. Samaveda Bhakta Vrinda ki jai. Gaura Premanandi Hari Hari Bol. Transcendental Book Distribution ki jai. Sankirtan Yagya ki jai. Srila Prabhupada's transcendental books ki jai. Gauda Premanandi, Hari Hari Bol. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to you, Srila Prabhupada. Thank you very much. Mukhaṁ Vishnuvaraya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Sunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarane. And may we all say, Vanchakalpa Tarubhyascha Kripasindubhya Evacha Patitanan Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Hare Krishna. Is it possible now to turn that on? The fan? Thank you very much. Hare Krishna. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So today we are reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 2, second canto. It is the first verse, text 1 of chapter 6. This chapter is titled Purusha Shukta Confirmed. So just before we read the text and the purport, we've been studying since chapter 1 the Purusha Shukta, or the gigantic universal form of the Lord. At different places, Srila Prabhupada has said, great philosophers have imagined the entire cosmic manifestation as the body of the Lord. And in some purports, Prabhupada wrote, for those who cannot reach or even meditate on the personal form of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, this gigantic external energy form is presented to them as the first step in God realization. So, in this room, I don't know how many we are, but we are Vaishnavas and Vaishnavis. We are transcendentally initiated and situated even beyond the 4 varnas and ashrams. Vaishnavis. So, I wanted to ask everyone a question. Do you think, and just by a show of hands, if anyone thinks, that this presentation of Purusha Shukta is a form of God that we should be focusing on and meditating on as his material, as his transcendental body of material energy? Does anyone feel that for Vaishnavas this is supposed to be something we meditate on? Please raise your hand. Don't just imitate me. So I am the only one in this room whose hand has been raised that, oh, one other, that believes that, okay, a few others, that we're actually supposed to study and meditate on this gigantic form of Krishna, even though we are all trained to see that Krishna has a spiritual body, and we completely have faith in that. So this is very interesting. Why so many chapters on a topic that for Vaishnavas and Vaishnavis, most of you think we can skip over this? Just summarizing the absence of raised hands. Okay, so with that as an introduction, we'll read today's text and purport, and then we'll talk about why I raised my hand. Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna. So text 1 begins, brahmovāca. vācām, vahner, mukham, kṣetraṁ, chandasāṁ, sapta, dhātavaḥ. Let me say that again. Dhātavaḥ, havya-kavyāmṛtānnānāṁ, jihvā, sarva-rasasya, brahmovāca, vācām vahner mukham kṣetraṁ, chandasāṁ sapta dhātavaḥ, havya-kavyāmṛtānnānāṁ, jihvā sarva-rasasya. Brahmovāca, vācām vahner mukham kṣetraṁ, chandasāṁ sapta dhātavaḥ, havya-kavyāmṛtānnānāṁ, jihvā sarva-rasasya. Havya-kavyāmṛtānnānāṁ, jihvā sarva-rasasya. Mataji's. kṣetraṁ, chandasāṁ sapta dhātavaḥ, havya-kavyāmṛtānnānāṁ, jihvā sarva-rasasya. Brahmovāca, vācām vahner mukham kṣetraṁ, chandasāṁ sapta dhātavaḥ, havya-kavyāmṛtānnānāṁ, jihvā sarva-rasasya. Okay, word meanings. Brahmā uvāca. Lord Brahmā said, vācām, of the voice, vahneḥ, of fire, mukham, the mouth, kṣetraṁ, the generating center, chandasāṁ, of the Vedic hymns such as Gāyatrī, sapta, 7, dhātavaḥ, skin and 6 other layers, havya-kavya, offerings for the demigods and the forefathers, amṛta, food for human beings, annānām, of all sorts of foodstuffs, jihvā, the tongue, sarva, all, rasasya, of all delicacies, also. So, translation and purport by Srila Prabhupada describing features of the Purusha Sukta, some of which we don't even understand how these are being generated but they are part of the universe, and they're part of what exists in the universe. So therefore, it's covered by the Purusha Shukta. It's part of the Purusha Shukta. It's part of God. Okay. Translation. Lord Brahma said, the mouth of the virāṭ-puruṣa, the universal form of the Lord, is the generating center of the voice, and the controlling deity is fire. His skin and 6 other layers are the generating centers of the Vedic hymns, and his tongue is the productive center of different foodstuffs and delicacies for offering to the demigods, the forefathers, and the general mass of people. So, kindly repeat. Lord Brahma said, the mouth of the virāṭ-puruṣa, the universal form of the Lord, is the generating center of the voice, and the controlling deity is fire. His skin and 6 other layers are the generating centers of the Vedic hymns. And his tongue is the productive center of different foodstuffs and delicacies for offering to the demigods, the forefathers, and the general mass of people. Well, this is interesting. The text says that fire is the controlling deity of voice. Is that something we normally would associate with voice? This is interesting. Oh, just as a point of reference, it's not, okay. We have sky, air, fire, water, and earth as the 5 original creative elements within the Mahatattva. So each element has a quality that it generates, and each subsequent element has all the qualities that were already generated. So if sound was already generated through sky and air, then when we come to fire, it's automatically included as a quality of fire. That's how I think of it, that each subsequent element has all the qualities of the previous one, so by the time you get to earth, it has all the qualities. Otherwise, it was hard for me to understand how fire is the controlling deity of the generating center of voice. Okay, so, purport. The opulences, maybe I can do it this way. The opulences of the universal form of the Lord are described herein. It is said that his mouth is the generating center of all kinds of voices, and its controlling deity is the fire demigod, and his skin and other 6 layers of bodily construction are the representative generating centers of the 7 kinds of Vedic hymns, like the Gāyatrī. Gāyatrī is the beginning of all Vedic mantras, and it is explained in the first volume of Srimad Bhagavatam. Since the generating centers are the different parts of the universal form of the Lord, and since the form of the Lord is transcendental to the material creation, it is to be understood that the voice, the tongue, the skin, etc., suggest that the Lord in his transcendental form is not without them. So, just pause for one comment. We have been trained to understand that everything in existence in this material energy is a tiny, sometimes perverted, it's described, but very, very tiny shadow or reflection of the ultimate reality that these things exist within God, within the spiritual kingdom of God, and within his form, his pastimes with his devotees, his paraphernalia, his abodes. Everything we see in this universe is coming originally from the spiritual world, and this is just like looking in the water and seeing a reflection of the tree. So by remembering that, and by seeing all these personal features, we can understand that God is personal and has personal features. That's what Prabhupada just wrote. One way of being reminded, and why looking at the material energy can help us think of God in his spiritual form. That's one of the reasons I raised my hand. Okay, continuing with the purport. In the spiritual world, all the perverted forms of material variegatedness are fully represented in their original spiritual identity. So we can't even imagine. Like voice. Humans have voices. Birds have voices. Beasts have voices. We've never heard the voices of the great demigods, but we're hearing the voice of great personalities as we recite the Bhagavatam, but these are all reflections of the original voices in the spiritual world. So if this is a tiny reflection, and sometimes the voices, like people who sing very beautifully, are so, we become attracted just by their musical rhythm and their musical sounds. This is just a reflection that in the spiritual world, as Lord Brahmā wrote, 10 million-fold greater is the singing of the spiritual voices in the spiritual world. So all of us have some experience hearing singers, not just kirtaniers, singers, but even mundane singers. 10 million-fold greater in every sense of sound and rhythm and just melody and the effect it has on us, 10 million times greater. That's what the voices are like in the spiritual world. How amazing is that to think about? So when we hear something material like voices, part of our meditation from the first step in God realization, the Purusha Shukta, is to immediately do that math. What a great voice. 10 million times greater is the voices of the spiritual resonance of the spiritual world, and even greater is God's voice. Prabhupada once said, all talking in the spiritual world is singing. All movement is dancing. If you've ever seen ballet or any great dancers, in addition to the kirtaniya dancers, 10 million times greater dancing ability, just the movement and the way it attracts our senses and mind, that's just ordinary movement in the spiritual planets, where every word is music and every step is dancing. So in that way, thinking about what we're exposed to in this external energy and immediately training our mind to project what this must be like in the spiritual world is how we as devotees can actually benefit from many chapters describing Purusha Shukta. And wait till you get to the 5th canto. The Puranic universe is part of the Purusha Sukta and the description of the planetary systems and how the universe is balanced, there are things in the 5th canto, Puranic descriptions, that are beyond imagination of puny humans. The greatest challenge we have in our museum of the Vedic planetarium is how to take something that's far beyond our puny mind and intelligence to grasp and explain it. That's a challenge. Okay, so just continuing in this purport. The spiritual world, all the perverted forms of material variegatedness are fully represented in their original spiritual identity. The only difference is that material activities are contaminated by the 3 modes of material nature, whereas the potencies in the spiritual world are all pure because they're engaged in the unalloyed, transcendental, loving service of the Lord. So that tells us something about the 3 modes of material nature. They cover completely the spiritual potencies. They completely present material variegatedness in a reflective, perverted reflective way. So even the mode of goodness, but especially since all material activity is originally born out of the mode of ignorance, especially the lower modes, they're just covering our spiritual consciousness. And that's why we've been taught that we are asleep. We're in this body, we're jihvas, but we're asleep. Just like when you're sleeping at night, you may forget where you are, what room you're in. You maybe even forget your body, what it is. Well, our jihvas, all of us, in varying degrees, are asleep, and we are all in the process of trying to awaken the sleeping soul. But until it's awakened, our consciousness is completely covered or partially covered by these 3 modes of nature, which is hiding the unlimited spiritual variegatedness and the unlimited spiritual opulences of the Lord and his kingdom. So when we see all the opulences in this universe, well, we don't see that because we don't see beyond our earth. But even on the earth, when we see people who have great opulence, that is such a tiny, almost insignificant reflection of true opulence that is visible to everyone in the spiritual world. So that's why we can't wait to get there and go back home, because what we're seeing is, if it's 10 million-fold, I don't know what that is as a fraction, but it's such an insignificant fraction of opulence, of beauty, of music, of dance, of everything, artistic abilities. We read in the Purusha Sukta that we see the beauty of nature. And Prabhupada writes, and the texts describe especially, like the beauty of different variegated birds that exist in the universe. And some of them have extraordinary coloring and appear very beautiful. So Prabhupada writes in those purports, that is a tiny, dim example of God's artistic abilities. 10 million-fold greater is what everything in the spiritual world looks like. So when you see the most beautiful parrot or cuckoo or peacock, can you imagine 10 million-fold greater beauty is the artistry of everything that exists in the spiritual world? So in this way, seeing things materially should immediately trigger in Vaishnavas and Vaishnavis that type of reflective, spiritual reflection. spiritual projection, and for us, even spiritual imagining what that must be like. So much greater than, if you enjoy the beauty of a peacock, 10 million times greater is the way everything is colored in the spiritual world. So in this way, seeing and hearing and observing this material manifestation can give us a tiny, tiny inkling, a tiny glimpse of what it must be like when we go back home, back to Godhead. But there's more to why we should be studying the Purusha Sukta than just for our own God realization. And we're coming to that. So, originally, I'm just skipping a little. Originally, this is a long purport. Since all the senses are produced of the Lord's reservoir of senses, the sensual activities of this material world are to be purified by the processes of devotional service. And thus the perfection of life can be attained simply by purifying the present position of our material activities. And the purifying process begins from the stage of being liberated from the conception of different designations. So that's a pretty intense sentence. If we are not, and I'll admit, if I am not fully liberated from conception of different designations, every now and then I slip. Oh, I'm a man. No, I'm not. But I call my male body me. Or I'm an American. No, I'm not. But because this body was born there, I say I'm an American. So I'm not completely liberated from bodily conceptions, because there are moments when someone asks me a question or I slip into certain behaviors based on bodily conceptions. So this sentence again, the purifying process begins from the stage of being liberated from the conception of different designations. But don't be discouraged, because despite the fact that we all, to varying degrees, still carry material designations in our consciousness, Prabhupada said, irrespective of that, Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and Sri Panchatattva has brought to all of us in this age the ultimate gift, the ultimate, beyond anything in the material universe, valuable treasure. The holy names of God, and especially in the Maha Mantra, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Every sound vibration of the holy names carries, which is hard to imagine, all the infinite and inconceivable potencies of God. Every syllable is non-different from his infinite potencies. So with that gift from Sri Panchatattva and Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, brought to the world by Srila Prabhupada, even though we're still in bodily designations to some extent, what is that? How can that stand in the presence of Krishna, who is identical with his name? He's present as soon as you utter his name. So it's like the blazing sun. How can darkness have any meaning when the sun comes up? Sometimes it's so blinding. Well, that's what the holy names are. They're blinding. We may not feel they're blinding yet. Here's the test of really being pure. It's from Sri Rupa Goswami, who said when he when he hears and tastes the holy names of the Lord, he wishes that he had millions of tongues to taste the nectar. Have we ever thought of wanting millions of tongues? Or he says, I wish I had millions of ears so that the nectar pours into my consciousness. Have any of us ever actually just sat back, oh, I wish I had millions of ears while I'm chanting japa or in a kirtan? But that's the pure state of a devotee. He actually wants millions of tongues and millions of ears because that's how much nectar is in Krishna. And Krishna and his name are identical. All his infinite sweetness is in the sound Krishna. So naturally, when we fully realize that, we're going to want millions of tongues, all of us, and millions of ears. We're not going to be able to resist wanting that many tongues and ears. So that day is coming for us as we keep chanting. So we'll just finish the purport. Every living entity is engaged in some sort of service, either for the self, or for the family, or for the society, or the country, and so on. But unfortunately, all such services are rendered due to material attachments. That's rendered means motivated. All such services are motivated by material attachments. The attachments of the material affinity, affinity means attraction. So the attachments of the material attractions may be simply changed to the service of the Lord, and thus the treatment of being freed from material attachments can begin automatically. Well, what does that even mean? Well, obviously, in the simplest form, we love hearing singing. It's natural. As soon as we switch that to hearing transcendental singing, transcendental sounds, the very tendency or propensity to be attached to music and sounds has now been purified. So that's our process. That is our sadhana. Switching every propensity that we're carrying, and carrying means since time immemorial, we have material attachments that have either already manifest or they're in a seed-like state ready to pop out, which will keep us entangled in material birth and death forever, practically speaking. We are carrying so many material attachments. The amazing thing about sadhana bhakti is how we can switch every one of those propensities and attachments into something that purifies us rather than entangles us. So that's the amazing process of sadhana. And if you ever catch yourself being attracted, you're looking at something, whether it's another human or a child or something in nature, if you catch yourself being attracted, try through your sadhana meditation to immediately apply this process of thinking that it's in Krishna, it's from Krishna. It's not real in terms of who the self is. All the philosophy and transcendental knowledge needs to be applied the second you feel yourself getting attached to anything. But that's our personal sadhana. But there's more to studying Purusha Shukta and how everything material is within God and therefore can remind us of God. So let's just finish this purport, another one or two sentences. The process of liberation is easier through devotional service than by any other methods. For in Bhagavad Gita, chapter 12, verse 5, it is said that one is subjected to various kinds of tribulations if one is impersonally attached. Klesho kantarastesham avyaktasakta-cetasam. So that's the purport to the very first verse of Purusha Sukta confirmed. The mouth of the virāṭ-puruṣa is the generating center of the voice, and so on. Controlling deity is fire. The skin and layers generate Vedic hymns. The tongue is the productive center of different foods and delicacies for all offerings. So, oh, just a quick Prabhupada story about foodstuffs offered to the Lord. Sometimes Prabhupada would have us join him in his quarters. Now, my best memories are from his quarters in New Dwarka, where he has a library room, a kitchen, then his sitting room is where he writes his books, and then his bedroom where he rests, receives massage, and honors prasadam. So sometimes Prabhupada would invite us into his quarters to have discussions, talk about various transcendental topics, or talk about how to understand the actions of the material energy in this world through the eyes of a pure devotee. And sometimes we would be engrossed in these amazing conversations. I used to call it in the back of my mind, history according to Prabhupada, because it's so different from the way history is taught anywhere in the world. What he sees in human activities and human history is so beyond what the superficial, limited vision of historians sees. Anyway, so right in the middle of these amazing, intense conversations, always on time at 12 noon, always, his servant would carry in a full thali of prasadam. And it was the most amazing experience to watch what happened. I don't know if I've explained this before, but in the middle of a sentence even, there would be, Prabhupada would leave us. I mean, literally, transcendentally leave us, tiny neophytes, and just go into the spiritual realm of seeing prasadam and Krishna himself as non-different. We would watch as almost like in a meditative samadhi trance. Prabhupada would rise and go to his little table where the prasadam plate was set and just be completely absorbed in a spiritual way that we couldn't do anything but observe. We didn't enter into that realm of seeing Krishna, so what to speak of seeing Krishna in his prasadam form. And when that happened, we knew something so amazing was taking place. We would be quiet instantly. We would offer obeisances so quietly. And then, standing up, we would tiptoe backwards until we got to the door and then just left. We were being so quiet to not disturb Prabhupada in any way because he was obviously in a spiritual trance. That's how Prabhupada honored prasadam. No talking. He was seeing Krishna. And we learned that one day we may even get a glimpse of feeling like that. And if we reflect on what we do sometimes around prasadam and what we talk about with others, it's so different. The way we honor prasadam and the way Prabhupada showed us how he honored prasadam. So I just mentioned that because this text is talking about the Puruṣa Suktas, the mouth of the universal form, and the tongue, and generating voices and tastes and so on. And the fire controlling, well, fire controls digestion, and so on. So in some ways we can relate to these very amazing descriptions of the Puruṣa Sukta just by seeing Prabhupada. So anyway, I wanted to share one or two sentences from earlier chapters, just to remind us of what we've already studied. I already forgot, so I had to write it down. Prabhupada once told me, literally he said this, remembering means remembering to write it down. So I wrote down a few sentences. Where it describes in the virāṭ-puruṣa that all of humanity is his residence. So the Puruṣa Sukta has a residence that's comprised of humanity. So I didn't understand that when I first read that. But Prabhupada said, that means that humans, it's the residence on the body of God, that humans are meant for God realization and to associate with God. And in the perfect human world, human society, there is complete unity, not just amongst humans, but between all living beings, even including wild animals. Perfect unity. And then another sentence in an earlier chapter. Each living being, we're part of the body of the Puruṣa Sukta, has a particular duty in relation to that supreme body. And then in that purport, Prabhupada said, the calamity of this age is disruptions in such duties. So what does that mean? Well, in the simplest sense, when we think about a body, my hands, okay? If there was disruption in the function, then instead of the hands serving the whole body, they'd be flapping, doing something that doesn't serve the whole body. So that would be bizarre. But if every human has a specific duty in relation to God because we're residing in his body, and if there's a disruption in that duty, if we're not focused on the hand serving the body, if we're not focused on the parts serving the whole, then in human society, it's just like flapping hands. You would say such a person is crazy. You would say such a civilization is a crazy civilization. And sometimes, imagine if the right hand and the left hand were fighting over possessions which have nothing to do with serving the body. Well, that's what we see all over human civilization. We see that false proprietorship, lording over material energy, and fighting others to take more and defend what we've already taken, and then attack to get more. And we're in a state of perpetual wars. Endless wars in this age of Kali, because all the bodily parts are dysfunctioning. Now, why do I mention this, and why does Prabhupada write about this? Well, here's the real reason, or the other reason, I should say, why I raised my hand. At different times, I had some conversations with Prabhupada about the future of our Hare Krishna movement. And in one such conversation, I was asking Prabhupada, is the Krishna consciousness movement truly going to envelop the entire earth? Is it one day going to establish on earth one unified kingdom, government over the whole earth? I mean, we have read throughout the Bhagavatam these amazing descriptions of these great kingdoms that are under the direction of great devoted kshatriyas, guided by very knowledgeable, empowered Brahmins. And I said, Prabhupada, is that going to happen within this 10,000-year period of the golden age of the Hare Krishna movement? So when I was asking that question, Prabhupada gave me a 2-word answer. Oh, yes. Literally, he said, when I asked, is this going to happen in this age? That once again there'll be a huge spiritual kingdom under a great devotee kshatriya, guided by great devotee Brahmins? Oh, yes. That is coming. Now, we don't think about that in our normal daily performance of our sadhana and our duties because we're not close to that yet. So I asked Srila Prabhupada, well, how is this going to come about? And then I started thinking of different revolutions. The American Revolution fought with the minority militias, but with weapons, and they overcame a greater force, and they forced a new government, a new country. Or in the Russian Revolution, the Tsar and his whole kingdom were attacked by a small, dedicated group of revolutionaries. So I said, is this going to happen by a small group? I didn't say of devotees, but I meant devotee warriors. He said, oh no. Well, then how will it happen? And here's what Prabhupada told me. He began this movement, what, 66? So it's what, how many years? 50, not even 60 years ago? After hundreds and hundreds of years of Sankirtan Yajna, of transcendental book distribution, never stopping, always continuing, always expanding, which is our duty to that future. Prabhupada said, Sankirtan Yajna is the only thing that can purify the entire atmosphere of the earthly planet. And as the atmosphere becomes surcharged with the transcendental potencies that are released from this transcendental yajna, Prabhupada said, all the people who are born beneath such atmosphere, in such atmospheres, they will be born with awakened religious sentiments. Just naturally, that atmosphere will cause that awakening in everyone. And Prabhupada told me, when that happens, when enough people have been born with that sentiment, it's the masses of people who will demand a Krishna-conscious government. Not by force, but the huge masses of populations will be crying for it because they have been awakened to that thought. So I just found this lesson about the future history to be so astonishing that we don't normally think that that's the result of our going out on Sankirtan, Harinam, book distribution, all the different forms of Sankirtan. But that's going to be one of the results. And then what happens? There will be, by the mass desire of the Earth's population, a Krishna-conscious government run by great Kshatriya devotees, guided by great Brahminical advisors. And they're going to have to change all of this dysfunction that's going on. Now, what does that mean? Again, it's not our duty or service in this lifetime. That's apparent. But the things that humans do to other inhabitants of this world, especially animals, that'll come to a stop. The Kshatriya government and the Brahmins guiding them will put an end to animal slaughterhouses. They're going to put an end to all the brothels and all the production of drugs and liquors, mass production and mass distribution of these intoxicants. We can't even imagine that a government would do that. The government will not allow any human activity that pollutes. You know, today, in a materialistic way, so many groups and such a large part of the world is dreaming about how do we stop pollution? How do we stop what we're doing to the atmosphere and the environment and polluting even the rivers and even the oceans? A fully Krishna-conscious government will actually have to know what pollutes, what doesn't pollute. So if you ever thought, well, let's talk about ecology and environmental protections, this is a mundane activity that the karmis are engaged in. Yes, but one day our movement will be guiding kshatriyas to make sure all the pollutants go away. It's not our duty right now as Brahmins, but maybe in 500 years it will be the duty of the Krishna conscious movement Brahmins to guide governments. Don't allow oil drilling. Now, we wouldn't say that now, or people might think we're irrational because the material world is run on oil. But in the future Krishna conscious government of the world, no oil drilling would be allowed. Things like that, which we don't think about as we need to know as our service. 500 years from now, I'm just making up that number, it'll be the service of the movement's Brahmins to know things like that and to guide the kshatriyas in what they should allow and what they should prevent, so that there is truly a pure golden age within this 10,000 year span that Prabhupada has told us is coming. So for me, studying the amazing external manifestations of the world, of Krishna's energies, the amazing variegatedness, is part of the future Brahmin's duty to know. And therefore, I think that although it may not be immediate for us right now to study and meditate on Purusha Sukta from that perspective, hundreds of years from now, it will be the duty of our Brahmins and our movement to truly study how Purusha Sukta works, how everything is part of God's body and has to be used, not flapping hands, but used for the benefit of the body as a whole. And that meditation is what we call, and then we'll take questions, what we call achintya bheda bheda tattva. Simultaneous oneness and difference. All the differences serving the one goal, the one supreme. That is our philosophy, and that's going to be applied someday in the future when our movement is going to be responsible for establishing a one-world government that completely functions for the benefit of God. And that's my understanding of Purusha Sukta and why we study it. Even though I'm not living in such a time yet, but John may probably say, maybe Prabhupada's plan for some of us is to keep taking births in our movement and help bring that about. We shall see. So, thank you very much for your kind listening. I know we're a little over time, but does anyone have any questions? Maybe one from the Vaishnavas and one from the Vaishnavis? If anyone raises a hand. Okay, any Vaishnavis? Oh yes, wait, here's one. Thank you.
You mentioned possibility of taking birth in the movement. Prabhupada often says that we take the Christian consciousness, become free from birth, death, old age, and disease.
That is true.
But they also mentioned that...
Could you speak louder, though?
A lot of devotees just keep on taking birth in the material world. He said that
A lot of devotees what?
they continually take birth.
Well, if they're not pure devotees, they do.
He said the 6 Goswamis eternally stay with Lord Chaitanya and take birth every time he does his pastimes. So...
Well, that's specific Leela.
The devotees that never go
I don't
back
want
to
to ever
Godhead?
compare any of us to the 6 Goswamis, who are manifestations of gopis in Chaitanya Leela. But so go ahead.
Well, do we go back to Godhead, or do we eternally just take part in Krishna's pastimes?
Okay, for our entire generation, first disciples, disciples of disciples, and on and on and on, the absolute goal is to go back home, back to Godhead. There's no doubt about that. And what does it take to go back home, back to Godhead, is the purification, the detachment from Maya, the detachment from sense gratification, and the engagement in sadhana. So that has to be our goal, or we won't even advance in sadhana. And when I say some may take birth again to help this movement, practically speaking, that may be none of us. But when a guru has many, many, many disciples who have not yet gone back to Godhead, there's a very famous letter that Prabhupada wrote in the late 1960s to Brahmananda, who was asking this question, Prabhupada, if some of your disciples haven't gone back to Godhead and take another birth, are you still their guru? Do you still have to take their sinful reactions? And Prabhupada wrote, yes. And then he said, the most famous line in the letter, so don't make me come back. So that should be the goal of every disciple. Don't make your spiritual master come back for you. But, being realists, if some disciples will need more guidance, maybe the guru will send some of his disciples to rescue them on his behalf. We have seen that during Prabhupada's actual manifest pastimes. If a devotee left, it would hurt Prabhupada. He would be so sad. He would really be affected by it. And sometimes he would send some of us to go find that devotee, even in a place where he was hiding, and bring him back to Prabhupada. I have some personal experience in that way. So it may be that Prabhupada or your guru, guru's guru as it goes on, may send some disciples to rescue disciples who have not yet become perfect and pure in one lifetime. And I don't see that as in any way contradicting the overall goal of we're here to go back home, back to Godhead, and to love Krishna in the way he wants us to love him the most and which pleases him the most. So that's how I can think of that. Thank you all for tolerating me. All glories to Srila Prabhupada and Sri Guru and Gauranga and all the Vaishnava and Vaishnavi devotees. Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna.